Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. A very warm welcome to yet another session of third Global Festival of Oneness. Let me begin with a small prayer. Om Sada Shiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru-Parampara Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Shri Dakshina Murtaye Namaha. Today we have a very special guest joining all the way from Canada, Shri Professor Arvind Sharma ji, and he will be speaking on a very important topic, a very unique topic, I would say, titled Towards an Advaitic Theory of Beauty. Before we go further, just a short introduction. Shri Professor Arvind Sharma ji was formerly of IAS, and he is currently the Birks Professor of Comparative Religion at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where he has taught for the past 30 years. And he has published extensively in the fields of comparative religion, especially on Indian religions, as well as several books on Advaita Vedanta. A very warm welcome to you, sir. We are very fortunate to have you here. We can start your session, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Niti. And thanks for this opportunity, for providing me with this opportunity. So let me start. I'd like to start by mentioning the name of a friend, Dr. Harsh V. Dahejia. He lives in Ottawa and is also a professor of Indian Studies at Carleton University. He's the author of several books, such as Finding Radha and so on. So one day he called me from Bombay, here in Montreal, and asked me if there is a Hindu theory of Saundarya or beauty. So we started exploring this thing and came up with the conclusion that although we have a theory of the appreciation of beauty, we might say, in the Rasa theory, which is so well known, famously associated with the name of Abhinav Gupta and others, but we could not identify a Hindu theory of beauty. So we had one of the appreciation of beauty. We have a theory of why we relish or enjoy beauty, but we do not seem to have a theory of beauty itself. Now, I could be mistaken on this, so please do correct me if I'm wrong. Now, that was some months ago, and stimulated by that conversation, I started exploring this idea of a theory of beauty within Hinduism. So as I proceed, let me clarify 2 points. One, I do not have a theory of beauty yet, but I am, I hope, moving towards a theory of beauty. And that's what I would be discussing in the rest of the talk. And the second point to clarify is that my focus at the moment is not on Hinduism in general, but on a constituent of it, a philosophical element of it, contained within it, namely Advaita Vedanta. So, as I proceed, I would like to say what I have to say in the form of 6 points. Now, the first point has to do with the realization that on the face of it, Advaita Vedanta would appear not very hospitable to the idea of providing a theory of beauty. In fact, it might even be somewhat hostile, because what is the main concern of Advaita Vedanta? Experientially, its main concern is to get rid of samsara and enable us to experience moksha. Now, samsara, as it is usually portrayed in the books on Moksha Shastra in general, and in Advaita Vedanta, is not a very pleasant place. This is a place we want to escape from. It is even described as a place of misery. The standard trope which is used to explain the relationship between the ultimate reality and this universe in which we are experiencing the samsara is explained with the help of the trope of the rope and the snake. I hope I did not lose control of my syntax in what I just said. The universe we are living in is depicted as a distortion of the ultimate reality, Brahman, in some way. And it is explained with the help of the analogy of the experience of a rope being mistaken for a snake. The metaphor is a very common one and may be enriched with the idea that, let us assume, some people are returning late at night after a pleasant evening at which they imbibe some amber liquids. And as they approach their place of residence, one of them sees something lying on the side of the steps. And he takes that to be a snake and recoils in horror, till his more sober friends point it out to him that it is not a snake but a rope, a coiled rope lying in a corner. Now, the way we can mistake a rope for a snake is the way our experience of this universe is represented in relation to the ultimate reality of Brahman. Now, the snake is not a very pleasant entity. In fact, it has even been suggested that the human race has an instinctive aversion of snakes because in the process of evolution, they used to live in swamps and the snakes would be hidden in the swamps and could unexpectedly bite them. And that is how we acquired a kind of a racial aversion to snakes. We would not associate beauty with snakes. So this is the world we are living in. Not a very pleasant place in terms of this metaphor. Now, how did we mistake a rope for a snake? And this is explained in the tradition in terms of Maya, which is a topic which, of course, deserves a special lecture in itself. But it has been invoked so often that I assume most of the audience would have some familiarity with it. It is supposed to operate in two ways. This power of illusion, this ability, this property, which can make something appear as something else, which is what Maya is. How does it operate? It operates in two ways. By suppressing the true nature of the object and by projecting a false nature. So the words used in the tradition for this are, of course, avaran, for suppressing the true nature of reality, and vikshep, for projecting something else. So when we mistake a rope for a snake, two things happen. The true nature of the rope is concealed from us. And in its place, a snake is projected. I believe in English we have two expressions, suppressio verae and suggestio falsae. Suppressing the truth, suppressio verae, and suggestio falsae, projecting the error. So it is clear that in terms of this truth, as we usually understand it, the prospect of Advaita Vedanta yielding a theory of beauty is very dim and remote. This is my first point. I move now to my second point, which is to suggest that if we did a second take and used a different approach, then the situation might change. That is, if we looked at this rope-snake metaphor from a slightly different angle. Please excuse me. That angle is the following one. That while it is true that the snake is a distortion of the rope, it is also true that wherever there is the snake, there must be the rope underlying it. The snake is thoroughly suffused with the rope. Without the rope, there couldn't be the snake. If we approach this truth, familiar truth, from such a perspective, then we can argue that Brahman, which is described as Sat Chitananand in Advaita Vedanta, then must appear within Maya as Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. That is to say, if Brahman is underlying Maya, then some of the aspects of Brahman, which we sometimes describe as Sat Chit and Anand, must also be present within that Maya, which I suggest might be as Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. It is worth recalling here Shankar's expression that the world before us, as it appears, is Satya Nirte Mithuni Kritya. truth and untruth have got coupled together. This then enables us to say that there could be beauty in the misery, however obscured. So this was my second point. The first point was that the world is described with the help of the metaphor of rope and snake, and the associations of that rope are such as do not seem very promising in terms of evolving a theory of beauty. But my second point was that if we changed our perspective and started examining the relationship between the rope and the snake as one, in which the snake must be present in some form in the rope, which is quite obvious empirically. If there was no coiled rope, there would be no illusion of the snake. So the rope has to be in the snake, in howsoever distorted a form. But it has to be there. So this enables us to approach our exploration with some degree of optimism. I now segue to the third point. How do we detect this element of beauty in misery? Now I like to propose that we can do this in two ways. I'll call these Model 1 and Model 2. Here's the outline of Model 1. Maya, as we understand it now, contains elements of both beauty and ugliness. And our effort then is what we might call or describe as Nirakshira Vivek. Milk and water have been mixed. And we have to extract the milk part from this mixture. That milk part is the Brahman in Maya, is the snake in the rope, is the Satchidanand, as Satyam Shivam Sundara. Now, we could probably confirm the application of this model in terms of real life by considering the experiences of beauty we have in life. Let us imagine going to a dramatic performance. A play like Abhijaan Shakuntalam or Romeo and Juliet. We feel excited and uplifted. We are then experiencing beauty in misery. We go to a dance performance. An artist has just performed the Bharatanatyam with consummate skill. We are entranced. Once again, we have experienced beauty. We go to a poetic symposium, a Kavi Sammelan, a Mushaira. we are carried away by the beauty of the expressions used by the poets. Once again, we are experiencing beauty in the midst of ugliness or misery. So, we have now enlarged the scope for moving towards a theory of beauty even more through such considerations. But now I turn to the second model. And to indicate the outlines of this model, I'd like you to think of a tragic performance. A play in which an ugly man, say, kills a beautiful girl. This whole incident is part of a larger play. But let us first focus on this incident of murder. Here we have an ugly man killing a beautiful girl. This corresponds to the first model. We have both ugliness and beauty. And in the first model, our attempt was to distinguish ugliness from beauty and to move from ugliness or misery to beauty. But now, for the second model, I would like us to look at the performance of the tragedy as a whole. To consider not merely the experience of that moment where the ugly man killed the beautiful girl, but to consider the aesthetic experience of the play as a whole. Could then the play do without murder? Could we have the passion of Jesus without the betrayal by Judas? Perhaps not. So once we take the entire play into account, our perspective on that ugliness also has to shift, has to change. Because it then becomes a part of this larger experience, aesthetic experience, of which it is an integral element. So that, in a sense, even the ugliness becomes part of the overall beauty of the play. So we can detect beauty in misery at these two levels. And at the second level, even the misery tends to get submerged, or at least diluted. At one end, one might even say merged at the other end. Now this, of course, then points to the paradoxical relationship between joy and sorrow in the world. Then we can contrast that with ugliness and beauty. For instance, consider Kalidas in the Raghuvansha. The scene describes Ram and Sita, and they are in an art gallery which depicts the life they spent when they were in exile. which was not a very pleasant time. And they had to suffer many hardships. Here we approach misery. But they are now depicted in paintings. And what does Kalidas say? Tayor yatha prarthitam indriyarthan asedusho sadmasu chitravatsu sukhani praptanya pidandakeshu sanchintya manani sukhanya bhuvan. Even the sorrows which they had experienced in the Dandaka forest, for instance, now became sources of joy. So we are having intimations of a dynamic dialectic between sukh and dukh, joy and sorrow, ugliness and beauty. One is also reminded the famous line from the Meghdut. Kasyanantam sukhopanata dukkham ekantatam. Who has experienced only joy or only sorrow? Niche gachet uparisidasha chakra nemikramena. Like the rim of a wheel, our conditions alternate. It's a lovely line. If somebody asks you, how are you doing? Api kushlam bhavata. You can always reply by saying, Kasya anantam sukham upanata dukkham ekanta. But I digress. Okay, so this is my third point, that we can detect elements of beauty even in misery. We can have experience of beauty even in this world of Maya, in these two forms, Pradarshas models, 1 and 2. Now I go to the next point. The fourth point. And I'd like to introduce this point by sharing some thoughts of Rumi, the great Islamic mystic. He points out that a painter who draws a portrait of an ugly person does not have to be ugly himself or herself. The fact that you draw an ugly portrait, very beautifully of course, does not indicate, is not proof of the fact that you are yourself ugly. And this is how sometimes in Islamic mysticism, evil in the world is justified as not indicating the presence of evil in God. That there is evil in God's world does not mean, need not mean that God is evil. Now, bringing in God in this way, we have introduced the idea of Saguna Brahma or Ishvara. Now, of course, if we think of the Nrsimha avatar of Vishnu in the context of rescuing Prahlad, with which many of us will be familiar, then even that ugliness may be redemptive if the appearance of the man lion appears fierce to the point of being ugly to us. Though, of course, some may object here to my depicting the missing avatar in any sense as ugly. But I hope you get my point. Actually, the point is a very interesting one. So let me, at the risk of digression, introduce it, though it may be of only marginal significance for our discussion at this present stage. But since we are engaged in an exploration, we can never really predict which element of it might suddenly become enlightening for our quest. The point I am trying to suggest is best described as an aesthetic theodicy. Now, what is theodicy? Theodicy is justifying the ways of God to man, or very briefly, reconciling the existence of suffering in the world with the ultimately good nature of the ultimate reality. Because there's an obvious contradiction or paradox here. If God is good, if Brahman is all Sat, Chit and Anand, how do we have suffering in the world? That's theodicy. That question is discussed in theodicy. And what I am going to suggest is, partly on the basis of our discussion, that we could also begin thinking in terms of an aesthetic theodicy, meaning trying to look at what is going on in the world, not in terms of justice or just suffering, but in terms of the experience of beauty. Let me explain this point. When we say that the innocent person suffers, and how do we explain that? We assume that the prevailing worldview in terms of which we seek to justify anything is characterized by justice. It does not seem to us to be fair that a good person, a virtuous person, a moral person should suffer. And this is one of the problems in theology. Why does this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? But this becomes an argument against the ultimate reality or God if we had presumed that the basic feature of this world has to be justice. And of course, the doctrine of karma in the Indic religious tradition might also incline us towards taking such a view of the world. But suppose the purpose of the world was not to just create a just world. It was to create a world in which people experience different kinds of emotions. Let us call them rasas. Shringar, Hasya, Karuna, Raudra, Bibats, Bhayanak, Veer, Adbhut, Shant. In terms of this reference, that is an aesthetic theodicy, there could be genuine suffering in the world to induce in us the rasa of karuna. So I shall present from any further exploration of this theme, but you can see where I am going, that if our search for the beauty theory of beauty leads us to the theory of rasa, then it can also lead us to another view of theodicy, which then becomes connected with beauty and rasa. But I shall desist from pursuing that course further, conclude my fourth point here, and move on to the next point, the fifth. Now, this fifth point, which we might consider in some sense an elaboration of the four, I would like to introduce the idea from Kashmir Shaivism that a distinction may be drawn within Maya between Shuddha Maya and Ashuddha Maya. Ashuddha Maya would be that part of Maya which leads us further into Maya. And Shuddha Maya will be that part of Maya which leads us out of Maya. How might we make sense of this? Perhaps with the following example. Suppose we were asleep and we got caught in a flash flood. And suddenly we woke up and realized that we are in the middle of a river, of this flash flood, generated by this flash. Now this is our problem. The flow of the water. We have to get out of it. But getting out of that water also means going through that water to the shore. That very water, if it carried us further, would be the source of our misery. But that very water, if we could walk through it to the shore, would save us. So we can distinguish between two dimensions of two aspects of our encounter with water. Similarly, we can speak in terms of Shuddha Maya and Ashuddha Maya. And we may now want to connect beauty with Shuddha Maya. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we started out with the role of Maya in the world, and we began with a totally negative picture, in the standard understanding of the trope of the rope and the snake. Then we created some room for beauty within this, with the realization that you can't have the snake without the rope. You can't have Maya without Brahman. And therefore, if Brahman is what we usually regard it to be, then some element of it must be present in Maya itself. And that could be associated with beauty. Then we moved on to the third point and developed two models of how to pursue this relationship, this dialectical relationship between opposites, like beauty and ugliness, and joy and sorrow, further, which further enlarged the scope for detecting beauty within the world. Then we rose the issue of the question of evil and beauty, and how even there, even within evil, in the context of evil, we could take a more generous view of the possibility of the existence of beauty. Finally, now we have enlarged the scope to a point where we can even think of Maya itself as consisting of Shuddha Maya and Ashuddha Maya. If we take in the developments in Advaitic thought, in the schools of such schools as Kashmir Shaivism, and actually even at the hands of the famous modern mystic Ramakrishna, who similarly uses this distinction between Shuddhamaya and Ashuddhamaya in his sermons. Now, this is as far as I've been able to explore this idea of developing an Advaitic theory of beauty. But let me then come to a final and sixth point with the following point in mind, that in Hindu philosophical systems, whenever you speculate in a philosophical sense, you always have praxis in mind. All our philosophical systems, at the end, follow up the discussion of theory with a discussion of praxis of how to realize the results of the theory we have discussed. So let me make that my final point, the praxis part. What could possibly be the praxis part of an Advaitic theory of beauty? So let me conclude with my final attempt at this. And for this, I would like us to consider the phenomenon of a mirage in a desert. Suppose we are lost in a desert. We are thirsty. We see a mirage in front of us. We see an oasis. We see a lake. We try to slake our thirst, and we are disappointed. There is no water, only more sand. And this is how the world seems to be often. Where could we find the beauty in it? Well, just imagine that when you were in the desert, wandering like this, you were not thirsty. If you were not thirsty and you saw a mirage in a desert, would you feel excited? Would you not feel excited rather than disappointed? Would you not widen your eyes in wonder that where there is not even a trace of water, you see a lake, you see trees reflected in that lake, you see an oasis? What a marvel! This is what Advaita Vedanta tells us the world will look like to us if we did not have any expectation from the world, if we were free from desires, if we had no vested interest in the world. It will be all beauty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for such a wonderful, insightful perspective into a topic that is not explored. I think I have never heard or read about Advaitic perspective on beauty. Viewers, if you have any questions, please do ask. As we wait for any questions from the audience, sir, I have one question. I found that the perspective about the rope and snake that he used to note that even in the Vyavaharika Dasha, in the snake, that rope must be there in some form. So in our tradition, that absolute sense of beauty is also associated with Brahman in some sense. For example, in the Vaishnava tradition, Krishna, the name Krishna is considered as all attractive. And Krishna is considered as Bhagavan Swayam. So in Bhagavad Purana it is said. So if Krishna is Parabrahman himself, so all attractive means he is all beautiful, the absolute beauty. So combining that with Advaitic notion, then it means that there is beauty is the Paramarthika Satya, whereas this duality between ugliness and beauty is at the level of only Vyavaharika. So what are your comments on this?
No, this sits very well with what we just discussed, because even if we insist that God is part of Maya, as Advaita does, as Maharishi Ramana says famously, God is the last illusion to go, but it is part of Shuddha Maya, not Ashuddha Maya. Yeah, it's a very helpful suggestion.
Yeah, and I have not received any questions from the audience. I think even this is a topic very new to them. So, let me see. There's something in the Q&A. Yeah. The question is, do the statement "a thing of beauty is joy forever" do not apply for Advaita?
No, it does. Let me give you an Advaitic explanation of the same. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Why is a thing of beauty a joy forever? The clue lies in the word forever. What is the definition of reality in Advaita Vedanta? Trikal abadhit. It should not be contradicted either in the past, the present, or the future. Or let me put it another way. What is the definition of reality? The definition of reality is that reality is that no part of which has ever to be discarded as unreal. Reality is that no part of which has ever to be discarded as unreal. Therefore, reality must always be real. Therefore, reality must always be. Always be. Therefore, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. This has reversed our discussion, the statement by Keats. The perspective is reversed in this.
Thank you, Professor. It is a very wonderful thought. There are few more, one or two more questions. Let me just read it out. One of the question is, do you think Shankara was well read in Bhartrihari's Sringara Shatakam, whose writings have a lot of non-dual leanings and deals with aesthetics in depth relating to truth sometimes?
I don't know enough about Bhartrihari. And even probably Shankara. Shankara has written so much to really answer this question. But of course, Shankara has a deep appreciation of beauty, Saundarya Lahari. Yeah. I need to think of it. Yeah.
I think Saundarya Lahari could be one avenue to explore for a Advaitic theory of beauty.
That's a very useful suggestion. Yes.
So we have no more questions. I think thank you again, Professor Arvindji, on the behalf of the entire Advaita Academy and all our viewers for taking time from your busy schedule for this very unique, very insightful session. I personally also enjoyed a lot, learned a lot from this session. Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome. And thanks for the privilege of your time.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste. Viewers, tomorrow morning we have a Sanskrit talk by Sri Bhima Shankar. It's on Advaita Vedantasya Moola Tattvanam Parichaya. It's an introductory talk, an outline of Advaita Vedanta in Sanskrit, followed by an English summary by Sri Jayaraman Mahadevanji. Do join us tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Shri Guru Pyo Namaha.